Our people have suffered grievously for the last 500 years. Our people have suffered so much in the last 500 years that it's one of the great miracles of history that any of us have survived at all. Our people have survived the greatest Holocaust, the greatest onslaught that any people, any race of people, has ever been called upon to face in the whole of human history. Yes, sir. Our people have been called upon to face a struggle where other people who have faced lesser struggles have died. As we look around the world today, we see any number of people who have died, who have disappeared from the face of the earth, who had to deal with the kind of struggle that our people have had to fight in the last 500 years. If we look at the Caribbean, 500 years ago when Columbus lost his way and stumbled upon the Caribbean islands, he met a race of people in the Caribbean islands, people called Arawaks or Caribs. According to the Spanish chroniclers and historians who came shortly after Columbus, the island of Hispaniola, to take one island in the Caribbean, was one of the most populous islands they had ever seen. Some historians estimate that there were anything from 600,000 to perhaps 11 million people on the island of Hispaniola in 1492, when Columbus, 10,000 miles off course, stumbled upon that island. Yes, within about 40 or 50 years of Columbus's arrival in Hispaniola, there were a few hundred Arawaks left. A whole race of people had disappeared from the face of the earth. The same thing happened in the other islands. The same thing happened in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in Jamaica, in the Bahama Islands, later on in the other islands as well. You had a whole race of people who disappeared from the face of the earth when called upon to face the kind of onslaught that African peoples have been fighting for the last 500 years. You look around other parts of the world and the story, this dismal story repeats itself over and over again. You come to North America, to the Native Americans, you go to Central America, to South America, you go to Australia with the Aborigines. Australia, a country which for years was bold-faced enough to have what they called a whites-only immigration policy. A country which was once the domain of black people, where they exterminated almost entirely the native black race. You have a case of Tasmania, the large island south of Australia, where every single black, white, black man, woman and child in Tasmania was wiped out, totally wiped out by the white usurpers. And the story repeats itself over and over again, and that's the kind of beast that African people have been struggling with for the last 500 years. People who have committed genocide, who have perpetrated holocausts everywhere they went as they expanded overseas. Beginning in the 15th century, in the 1400s, beginning with the Portuguese and the Spaniards, later on with the British and the French and the Dutch and the Danes and the others. You can trace the history of European expansion overseas by its history of genocide. Everywhere they went, they committed genocide. Yes, sir. So I say the only reason why Africans have survived is first of all because there were so many of us to begin with. Secondly, because of our great resilience. We were born fighters. We fought a good fight, a fight that nobody else fought. The mere fact of having survived in that situation where other people succumbed entirely is in itself a great triumph, a great epic, one of the great epics of human history. We survived because we had great enlightened leadership. We have been blessed as a race of people over the years with enlightened, fearless leadership. We have been blessed over the years with leaders who were dedicated to the people, who were honest, who had a correct ideology. In recent years, that ideology has manifested itself in a variety of forms of African or black nationalism. The methods used by the European to exterminate us and to exterminate other people were legion. Sometimes the European waged total war against the unfortunate people they came in contact with. Sometimes they waged wanton destruction. In the case of the Caribbean in Hispaniola, the island which today is shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the Spanish abolitionist priest, Bartolomé de las Casas, tells us that the Spaniards in Hispaniola and the other islands after Columbus waged wanton, destructive fury upon the native inhabitants. They would go competitions among themselves to see who could kill the most so-called Indians. They call them Indians. Who could kill the most Indians in a day. They would go competitions among themselves to see who among the Spaniards could cut off an Indian so-called head with one blow of the sword. They would gather the Indian so-called notables in a large building, set the building on fire. They would barbecue the Arawaks, 13 at a time, in honor of Jesus Christ and his 12 apostles. Kill them, burn them to death, barbecue them. They would, according to Las Casas, they would cut off the limbs of Indian children and throw them to their dogs. Sometimes they supplemented their wanton destruction by the use of disease. The Europeans introduced a variety of new diseases that Africans and Aborigines and people in the Caribbean had never experienced before. Smallpox, as you all know from the North American experience with the smallpox blankets which were given to the Native Americans. Smallpox became an instrument of genocide and destruction. The same was true of syphilis. They blamed the so-called Indians in Hispaniola for giving them syphilis, but in fact, the only documented evidence we have about the spread of syphilis is that syphilis moved around the world in the wake of European expansion. Wherever Europeans went, they took syphilis. If you trace the history of syphilis around the world, you can trace the history of syphilis around the world by looking at when the Europeans, quote unquote, discovered any particular area. If the Europeans got to Senegal in 1505, well, that's when syphilis came to Senegal. And if they got to Nigeria in 1506, that's when syphilis first appears in Nigeria. And if they got to South Africa in 1511, that marks the beginning of syphilis in South Africa. Everywhere that the Europeans went, syphilis was originally named after whichever kind of European brought it to them. In some places, syphilis was a French disease because the Frenchmen brought it to them. In some places, it was the English disease because it was the English who brought it to them. In some other areas, it was the Portuguese disease and so on. And in the case of syphilis, you have a most bizarre and alarming parallel in the history of AIDS in the last few years. Syphilis in the 1500s was the AIDS of that period in time. As the Europeans moved around the world destroying, yes, there were collaborators from among the conquered people. Yes, there were African collaborators. But don't for a minute believe, as some have tried to argue recently, that somehow the African traitors who collaborated with the white Jews and Gentiles were somehow equal in guilt to those who brought slavery and destruction to their land. Every struggle in the history of the world has always had its collaborators, its traitors. During the Second World War, you had people they called Quislings in Europe, Norway, elsewhere, who collaborated with the Nazis. During the Second World War, you had Zionists, Jews, Zionists, who collaborated with the Nazis. During the American War of Independence, you had Americans who collaborated with the British. Jesus Christ had his Judas. So collaboration is nothing new. But collaboration does not make the primary responsibility. The collaborators themselves were nothing but secondary factors in a destruction which was engineered out of Europe. Out of all these factors came the slave trade. The slave trade was the real crux of our particular Holocaust. Slavery and the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, which brought us here to the Americas. One of the major means of genocide by which the Europeans perpetrated the slave trade was by rationalizing the slave trade. It's very interesting, but even though the slave trade was a physical thing, which involved the total physical destruction of hundreds of millions of our people, an important part of that genocidal destruction has to do with the intellectual pretexts, the excuses, the rationales that the Europeans came up with. Before the Europeans killed us, they felt it necessary to justify what they were doing. For a while, they just justified our enslavement by saying that we were not Christian, we were heathens. Some of the Roman Catholics began Christianizing the slaves, so it became impossible to argue that we were not Christians, and that was the reason. So they looked at other pretexts to justify their genocide. Sooner or later, they came to the pretext that we weren't human. Thomas Jefferson, the great founding father, he wrote a book called Notes on the State of Virginia in the 1700s, in which he argued that Africans were less than human. Hence, they should be justifiably enslaved. Most of the major intellectual figures in Europe said the same thing. Hegel, great German philosopher, a whole bunch of them said the same thing. Africans were less than human, therefore they could justifiably be enslaved. In other words, they were setting up an intellectual justification for genocide. The most pernicious of all of these intellectual justifications for genocide was what they came to call the Hamitic myth. The idea that somehow we were cursed by God himself. But God himself had ordained that Africans would always be slaves. And the blame for this Hamitic myth, which ultimately resulted in the death of maybe 300 million or more of our people, lies with the Jewish rabbis, the people who invented the Talmud. The so-called Talmudic sages, the people who put together that most holy of Jewish books. It was in the Talmud, the so-called Babylonian Talmud, 1,000 years before the African slave trade, the Transatlantic slave trade, that is. 1,000 years, 300-400 AD, that is when the Jewish rabbis, so-called sages, invented the Hamitic myth, put the curse of God on Africans. And that was the myth 1,000 years later, which was revived by Jew and Gentile slaveholder alike. And that myth became the basis, the intellectual basis for the destruction of maybe 300 million or more of our people.
That's right.
The Hamitic myth came out of the book of Genesis in the Bible. The book of Genesis claimed that Noah had gotten drunk in his tent. His son Ham had looked upon him in his nakedness. Noah supposedly came to eventually and cursed Ham's son Canaan and his children after him for having gazed upon Noah in his nakedness. And there the story ended in the book of Genesis. It was the Jewish sages who then injected a racial component and somehow invented the fact that Ham somehow was the first African, and that the curse on Ham in the Bible therefore was a curse on Africans. And it was this curse then which became the justification, the intellectual underpinning for our Holocaust.
That's right. That's right.
There are many sources for this information, but the source that I like to quote is one which I quoted here in my book, The Jewish Onslaught, and I'm going to read it for you from the Jewish scholar Harold D. Brackman. Brackman has been going around the country of late, writing letters to the New York Times. I even saw a letter of his in the black press and all, saying that people like myself are misquoting him. Brackman made the mistake of writing a PhD dissertation in 1977 for UCLA. His dissertation is called The Ebb and Flow of History. It's a study of black Jewish relations up to 1900. The arrogance and intolerance and ignorance of people who oppress us is absolutely amazing sometimes. They feel that they can write things in their books for their own consumption, but they underestimate our intelligence to such an extent that somehow when they write this foolishness in their books, they figure we will never have the sense to go and read their books and quote them.